Ilara pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the cellar and held her breath. Footsteps moved above her, heavy boots crossing the kitchen floor, stopping right over her head. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. If the head chef looked down the cellar stairs now, if he saw the basket of apples she was not supposed to touch, there would be no explaining it away. Not tonight, not on the night of the Ascension Feast, when every apple, every drop of honey, every pinch of salt in this palace belonged to the grand dishes being prepared upstairs. The footsteps moved on. A door creaked. Ilara let out the breath she had been holding and looked down at the 6 apples cradled against her apron. Her hands were shaking, though she told herself it was only the cold of the cellar and not fear. She was 17 years old and had lived in this palace since she was a baby left at the gates, and in all that time she had never once broken a kitchen rule this large. Tonight she was about to break several. Above her, in the vast halls of the palace, the kingdom of Veyrath was gathering for the most important night of the year. The Ascension Feast marked the day the current Alpha King had taken his throne, and every noble house sent their finest cooks to compete for a single honor, to have their dish chosen as the king's favorite. It was said that whichever house won that honor gained influence in the court for an entire year. Alliances were built on it. Marriages were arranged because of it. Grown men had wept when their dishes were passed over. This year, the kitchen was consumed by talk of one dish above all others. The royal chef of House Dracot had spent 11 days preparing a swan, its skin brushed with real gold leaf so thin it dissolved on the tongue, its body stuffed with saffron rice and quail eggs, its wings arranged to look as if it were still flying. Ilara had seen it that afternoon, resting on a silver tray the size of a small table, and she had to admit it was beautiful. It looked less like food and more like a piece of art that had wandered into the kitchen by mistake. She was not part of that world. Ilara belonged to the lowest tier of kitchen workers, the ones who scrubbed pots black with soot and hauled water up 3 flights of stairs and never once touched a dish that would leave the kitchen. She had been given the task of fetching apples only because the pastry assistant had cut her finger and there was no one else free to send. Ilara had gone down to the cellar, filled her basket, and on her way back up, she had stopped outside the head chef's office and heard something that changed the shape of her evening entirely. Peasant food, the head chef, a tall stern man named Edwin Voss, had said to his assistant, his voice full of scorn, "That's what half these dishes taste like underneath all this decoration. If I had my way, none of it would be fit for a king. But it doesn't matter what I think. The king eats what tradition tells him to eat, and tradition says gold and swan and saffron, not apples, not simple things. Simple things are for simple people." Ilara had stood frozen in the hallway, apples pressing into her ribs through the basket, and something old and warm had risen in her chest. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who had raised her in the palace laundry rooms until she passed 3 winters ago, a woman who had never once cooked anything with gold leaf or saffron in her life. Her grandmother's apple tart had been the only thing in Ilara's whole life that had ever tasted like home. Simple pastry, simple apples, a little cinnamon, a little butter, baked until the kitchen smelled like the inside of an autumn afternoon. Simple things are for simple people, Edwin Voss had said, and Ilara had felt something stubborn settle into her spine. She did not decide right then to bake the tart. That decision came later, quietly, while she carried the apples up the last flight of stairs and thought about her grandmother's hands guiding hers over a mixing bowl. By the time she reached the top step, she had already decided. She would bake 1 tart. Just 1. No one had to know. No one had to see. She would bake it in the small forgotten oven in the servants' quarters, the one nobody used anymore because its door did not close all the way, and its heat was uneven and unreliable. She would bake it because her grandmother deserved to be remembered, and because some stubborn corner of her heart refused to let the head chef's words go unanswered, even if he never knew she had answered them. The feast, meanwhile, had already begun several floors above the kitchens, in the great hall of Veyrath Palace, where high stone arches rose toward painted ceilings and candlelight fell across tables long enough to seat 200 guests. At the head of the hall, seated on a throne carved from black oak and lined with silver wolf heads, sat the Alpha King himself, Draven Ashwood, ruler of Veyrath and leader of every pack sworn to its crown. He did not look like a man enjoying his own celebration. Draven's jaw was tight, his eyes distant, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the arm of his throne, that only those closest to him would have recognized as restlessness rather than patience. Beside him sat his most trusted advisor, a lean, gray-eyed man named Felix Ambrose, who had served the crown since Draven was a boy learning to control his first shift. "You look like a man sitting through his own funeral," Felix murmured, leaning close enough that only Draven could hear him over the music and chatter filling the hall. "I look like a man who has eaten the same 11 dishes for the same 11 years, Draven said, not quite joking. Gold on the Swan again this year, Felix. Did you notice? Gold, as if that changes the taste of the bird underneath it. The nobles believe it honors you. The nobles believe gold honors everything. I have started to wonder if they would gild the wine if they could. Felix said nothing to that, though the corner of his mouth twitched. He had learned, over the years, when to let his king's mood pass unchallenged and when to gently redirect it. Tonight he judged it wiser to redirect. The Swan will be presented within the hour. House Dracot has spent a fortune on it. Try to look pleased when it arrives, even if the taste bores you. Draven exhaled through his nose, a sound closer to a low growl than a sigh, though there was no real anger in it. Around him, the great hall buzzed with noble families dressed in furs and silks, their conversations light and performative, their eyes constantly flicking toward the throne to gauge the king's mood, before deciding how loudly they were permitted to laugh. It was, Draven often thought privately, exhausting to be watched every moment of every meal, to have every bite he took analyzed for meaning it did not contain. He had been Alpha King for 9 years, crowned young after his father's sudden death, and in that time the feasts had grown steadily more extravagant, while somehow tasting steadily less like anything at all. Every dish was built to impress rather than to satisfy. Every plate arrived designed to be looked at first and eaten second, if it was eaten with any real appetite at all. Draven could not remember the last time a meal in this hall had made him feel anything beyond mild, polite tolerance. He shifted in his seat, and as he did, something unfamiliar drifted across his senses. Draven's nose, sharper than any human's by a wide margin, caught scents most people in the hall would never notice at all. Layers of perfume and roasted meat and burning candle wax all blending into the general noise of a feast. But underneath all of it, faint and fleeting, came something else. Something warm. Something that did not belong to any dish being prepared for the royal table tonight. Cinnamon, baked apple, butter turning golden in a hot pan. Draven's head turned slightly before he even realized he had moved it, his attention pulled toward the far end of the hall, toward the direction of the kitchens, though the scent was so faint he could not be certain it was even real. He blinked, and for a moment he almost dismissed it as imagination, some trick of hunger and boredom combining into a phantom memory. But wolves did not imagine sense. It was one of the oldest truths of his kind. A wolf's nose did not lie, even when a wolf's mind wished it would. Draven. Felix's voice cut through his thoughts. You've gone somewhere else. I smell something, Draven said quietly, still facing the far end of the hall. Felix followed his gaze, seeing nothing but tapestries and torchlight. The kitchens are 3 floors below us. What could you possibly smell from here? I don't know, Draven admitted, and for the first time all evening, something like genuine curiosity moved through him, cutting straight through the fog of boredom that had settled over him for years. But it isn't gold, and it isn't Swan, and it is the first thing all night that has made me want to know what it is. Down in the servants' quarters, 3 floors below the great hall and its 200 watching eyes, Alara knelt in front of the small crooked oven, coaxing a stubborn fire into life with hands that had not entirely stopped shaking. She had 6 apples peeled and sliced thin on a wooden board beside her, a small bowl of flour borrowed quietly from the pantry, a nub of butter she had told herself she would replace somehow, and no idea at all whether any of this would work. Her grandmother had never written the recipe down. There had been no need. Alara had watched her make it 100 times across 100 quiet evenings, memorizing not the exact measurements but the feeling of it, the way the dough should look soft but not sticky, the way the apples should be arranged in careful rings, the way the whole kitchen would begin to smell like something good, long before the tart was ever finished baking. She had never made it alone before. She had never needed to. Her grandmother had always been there, humming softly, correcting her grip on the rolling pin with a gentle hand over hers. Tonight there was no one to correct her. There was only Alara, a crooked oven, 6 apples, and a stubbornness that had planted itself in her chest the moment she heard the words, "Simple things are for simple people," and had not left since. She did not know, kneeling there in the flickering firelight of a forgotten room, that 3 floors above her a king was already rising from his throne, following a scent he could not explain, moving toward her before either of them understood what that meant. Nora nearly dropped the bucket of water she was carrying when she rounded the corner and found Alara crouched in front of the old oven, flour dusted across her apron and both cheeks flushed from the heat of the fire. Nora was 16, a scullery maid who shared a narrow room with Alara at the end of the servants' corridor, and the two of them had been close as sisters since the year Alara's grandmother passed. "What are you doing?" Nora whispered, though there was no one else nearby to hear. "That oven hasn't worked properly in 2 years. Half the servants think it's cursed." "It works well enough," Alara said, though even as she said it, The fire inside popped and hissed unevenly, sending a small puff of smoke curling out through the crooked door. She pressed her lips together and adjusted a log, coaxing the heat toward one side of the small chamber. I only need it to work for an hour. For what? Alara hesitated, then gestured toward the wooden board where the tart sat waiting, its pastry base already pressed into a small dented pan she had borrowed from the pot room, apples arranged in careful overlapping rings across the top, a light dusting of sugar and cinnamon already sinking into the fruit. Nora's eyes went wide. You're baking, tonight, during the feast. Nora set the bucket down slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might make the whole scene disappear. Alara, if Chef Voss finds out you used kitchen apples for something that isn't on his approved list, he will have you scrubbing floors until winter, or worse. He won't find out, Alara said, with more confidence than she felt. Everyone upstairs is busy with the Swan. No one comes down here. This oven hasn't been touched by anyone but mice in years. That's exactly why it might not work at all, Nora pointed out, crouching beside her friend, and peering doubtfully at the flickering flame. Look at that fire. It's climbing on one side and dying on the other. You'll burn half the tart and leave the rest raw. Then I'll turn it, Alara said simply. Will you keep watch for me? Just at the end of the hall. If anyone comes this way, knock twice on the wall. Nora studied her friend for a long moment, and whatever protest she had been building faded when she saw the look on Alara's face. That same stubborn set of the jaw Alara always wore whenever she had already decided something, and no argument in the world was going to move her from it. Nora sighed and rose to her feet. 2 years I've known you, and never once have you done something reckless. I suppose it had to happen eventually. It's not reckless. It's one tart. It's one tart baked in secret during the most important feast of the year, using ingredients meant for the king's table, in an oven that might collapse the moment you look at it wrong. Nora shook her head, though there was a small smile tugging at her mouth despite herself. I'll keep watch. But if Chef Voss comes down here, I am running the other direction and pretending I never saw you. Fair enough, Alara said, and Nora disappeared down the corridor to take up her post near the stairwell, leaving Alara alone once more with the fire, the apples, and the fragile hope that this would work. She slid the tart into the oven with careful hands, closing the crooked door as much as it would allow, which was not quite all the way. A thin line of orange firelight glowed along the gap, and smoke drifted lazily upward through it. But Alara told herself the smoke would dissipate before it ever reached anyone important. She settled onto an overturned crate to wait, watching the gap in the door, listening for any change in the sound of the fire that might tell her something had gone wrong. The minutes stretched long and uneven. Twice Alara had to add more wood, adjusting the logs with a metal poker to keep the heat balanced, and once the smoke grew thick enough that she had to crack open the small window near the ceiling to keep from choking on it. She thought, more than once, that Nora was right, and this whole plan was foolish. She thought about what would happen if Edwin Voss did find her here, about the punishments he had handed out before to servants who broke his rules, about the fact that an orphan with no family name to protect her had far less room for mistakes than anyone else in this palace. And then she thought of her grandmother's hands, weathered and sure, guiding the rolling pin across the dough, humming some old tune with no words that Alara had never learned. She thought of the way her grandmother used to say that food made with love always tasted different than food made with only skill, no matter how much gold sat on top of it. Alara had never understood that fully until tonight, kneeling in front of a broken oven, risking everything she had for a dish that no one but her would ever taste. But she understood it now, sitting there in the dim firelight, waiting. 3 floors above her, Draven had already risen from his throne. The great hall fell into a ripple of confused murmurs as the king stood mid-feast, well before the ceremonial presentation of the Swan, well before any of the traditional toasts or speeches that were meant to fill this hour of the evening. Nobles at the nearest tables exchanged glances. A young lord from House Ashgrove leaned toward his companion and whispered something behind a raised hand. At the high table, Lady Rosalind Ashgrove watched the king with narrowed, calculating eyes, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her wineglass. Your Majesty? Felix rose beside him, alarm flickering across his usually composed features. Is something wrong? Nothing is wrong, Draven said, though his gaze was already fixed on the far archway leading toward the lower halls of the palace. I need air. You need air in the middle of the Ascension Feast? Draven, the Swan is nearly ready. House Dracot has been preparing it for 11 days. If you leave now, I will be back before it arrives, Draven said, already stepping down from the raised dais where his throne sat. Keep the hall entertained. Tell them I felt unwell. Tell them anything you like. Felix hurried after him, lowering his voice further as they moved past the edge of the high table, out of easy earshot of the nearest nobles. You cannot simply walk out of your own feast because of a smell, Draven. Do you understand how this looks? Half this room is already whispering. Let them whisper. Draven's steps did not slow. If anything, they quickened, drawn forward by something Felix could not perceive at all, some invisible thread pulling the king toward the lower halls of his own palace, with an urgency that had nothing to do with duty or ceremony. 9 years, Felix. 9 years of gold-dusted birds and honeyed wine and speeches I could recite in my sleep. For 9 years nothing in this palace has surprised me. Tonight something has. I am not letting it go simply because it is inconvenient timing. Felix opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it again, recognizing the particular set of his king's shoulders, the same stubborn line Draven's father had carried whenever he had made up his mind about something and no counsel would move him from it. Instead, Felix fell into step just behind him, matching his pace, ready at least to be present for whatever this strange restlessness led toward. They passed through a side corridor lined with old tapestries depicting the founding pacts of Vayreth, past 2 startled guards who straightened immediately at the sight of their king moving briskly through halls he rarely walked without an entire procession trailing behind him. One of the guards, a broad-shouldered man named Callum Ward who served as captain of the palace guard, fell into step alongside Felix with a questioning look. "Is everything all right, my lord?" Callum asked quietly. "The king rarely leaves the hall during the feast." "I wish I could tell you," Felix admitted. "He says he smells something." Callum's brow furrowed, his hand drifting instinctively toward the hilt of his sword, old instincts from years of protecting the crown rising automatically. "Smells something dangerous?" He didn't say dangerous, he said interesting. Felix shook his head slightly, still hurrying to keep pace, which in 9 years of knowing this man, might be the more concerning of the 2 possibilities. Draven led them down a narrower staircase, one used mostly by servants rather than nobility, the stone steps worn smooth by generations of quick feet carrying trays and buckets and firewood. The scent grew stronger the further down they went, warm and sweet and utterly unlike anything served at the royal table. Cinnamon, unmistakable now. Baked apple, rich and caramelized. Something else beneath it too, something simpler, something that reminded Draven, absurdly, of a memory he had not visited in years. His mother's hands, long before she passed, pressing dough into a pan in the small kitchen of the summer house, where his family used to escape the formality of the main palace. He had not thought of that kitchen in a very long time. The corridor narrowed further, torches growing sparse, until faint firelight spilled from a half-open door at the end of the hall, and with it came the scent, stronger now than ever, undeniable, pulling him the last few steps forward until he stood at the threshold of the small forgotten servant's kitchen, staring at a young woman kneeling in front of a crooked smoking oven, utterly unaware that the king of Vayreth was standing in her doorway. Nora, posted at the far end of the corridor as a lookout, had been watching the main stairwell, the one servants used most often at this hour. She had not expected anyone to come from the narrow side passage that connected to the upper halls, the one so rarely used that most of the staff had forgotten it existed at all. By the time she heard the low murmur of unfamiliar voices and turned to look, it was already too late to knock twice on the wall, too late to warn her friend of anything at all. The Alpha King of Vayreth stood in the doorway of the servants' kitchen, and Alara had not yet noticed him standing there. Alara felt the change in the room before she understood why. The air shifted, the way it sometimes did when a door opened onto a colder hallway, and some instinct older than thought made the small hairs on the back of her neck rise. She turned from the oven, poker still in hand, expecting Nora, expecting perhaps Chef Voss come to end her small rebellion before it had even finished baking. She did not expect the king. For one full breath, Alara simply stared, certain her mind was inventing this, certain that exhaustion and smoke and fear had finally combined into some waking dream. Draven Ashwood stood in the doorway of the servants' kitchen, still dressed in the deep blue and silver of the feast above, his presence filling the small room in a way that had nothing to do with his height or his broad shoulders, and everything to do with something Alara could not name, some quality that made every other person she had ever met feel smaller by comparison. Behind him, Felix and Callum crowded into the narrow doorway, both wearing expressions of open astonishment at the sight before them. A smoking oven, a young kitchen girl frozen mid-motion, apples scattered across a wooden board, and absolutely nothing that resembled a threat to the king's safety, which seemed to confuse them more than any actual danger would have. Alara's first thought, wild and immediate, was that she had been caught stealing. Her second thought, arriving a half-second behind the first with considerably more force, was that stealing apples was the least of her worries now that the king himself stood witness to it. She dropped into a hurried, clumsy curtsy, nearly knocking over the wooden board in the process, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I am so sorry. I did not know anyone would—" "What is that smell?" Draven interrupted, though not unkindly. His eyes had already moved past her, to the crooked oven, to the thin curl of smoke escaping through its ill-fitting door, to whatever lay hidden inside it that had pulled him 3 floors down through his own palace in the middle of his own feast. Alara blinked, thrown entirely off balance by the question. She had braced herself for accusation, for punishment, for the cold fury she imagined a king might carry toward a servant who had stolen ingredients from the royal kitchen. She had not braced herself for genuine curiosity. She hesitated, glancing toward the oven and back to the king's face, trying to read some sign of what answer would save her from whatever consequence was surely coming. Finding none, she simply told the truth, because she could think of nothing else to do. "It's an apple tart, Your Majesty. A simple one. I used apples from the cellar without permission. I should not have taken them, and I take full responsibility, and I understand if— May I see it?" The question landed so far outside anything Alara had expected that she simply stood there for a moment, mouth slightly open, certain she had misheard him. Behind Draven, Felix's eyebrows had climbed nearly to his hairline, and Callum's hand had finally relaxed away from his sword hilt entirely, though his expression suggested he was still waiting for some hidden danger to reveal itself. "It isn't finished baking yet, Your Majesty," Alara managed. "I don't know if it's any good at all. I've never made it without my grandmother helping me before, and the oven doesn't hold heat evenly, and I worried the whole time that one side might burn while the other stayed raw, and—" She stopped herself, aware she was babbling, aware that babbling in front of the king was very likely just as unwise as stealing apples in the first place, though she could not seem to stop the words from tumbling out now that they had started. Draven, to her complete confusion, looked almost amused. "You are worried about whether a tart is properly baked, in front of the king you feared moments ago would have you punished for theft." Alara felt her face heat, embarrassment layering over her fear. "I suppose that does sound foolish when you say it aloud." "I did not say foolish." Draven stepped further into the room, close enough now that Alara had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, and she noticed, with a small distant part of her mind still capable of noticing anything at all, that his eyes were a deep amber brown, striking even in the dim firelight. "I said interesting. Nothing about tonight has been foolish so far. Rare, perhaps. Foolish, no." Behind him, Felix cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should return to the hall before the Swan is presented. House Dracot has worked 11 days on. The Swan can wait a few more minutes." Draven did not look away from Alara, from the small crooked oven, from the strange pull that had brought him here, and had not yet released him. "What is your name?" "Alara," she said, then added, uncertain of the proper form of address, "Alara, Your Majesty. I don't have a family name. I was left at the gates as a baby. I was raised here, in the palace." Something in Draven's expression shifted at that, a flicker of something Alara could not quite name, gone as quickly as it appeared. "An orphan raised inside the palace of a king, and yet somewhere along the way you learned to bake something that pulled me away from a feast 11 days in the making. That seems worth understanding better, wouldn't you agree, Felix?" Felix, still visibly uncertain what to make of any of this, offered only a diplomatic nod. Callum, standing slightly behind them both, had begun to relax fully now, recognizing that whatever strange situation this was, it did not appear to threaten his king in any way that required intervention. The tart, at that moment, chose to announce its presence in the most inconvenient way possible. A soft hissing sound rose from the oven, followed by a thin wisp of smoke thickening rapidly through the gap in the crooked door, and Alara's stomach dropped as she realized, with sudden horror, that the uneven fire she had worried about all evening had finally caught the edge of the pastry. "It's burning," she gasped, forgetting entirely, for one full second, that a king stood beside her, forgetting everything except the fact that her grandmother's recipe was about to turn to ash, in front of the very person she had never intended to see it at all. She lunged for the oven, wrapping her hand hastily in the edge of her apron, and pulled the door open, smoke billowing out around her as she reached inside and drew the pan free with quick, practiced movements, born of years spent handling hot pots and pans without proper tools to protect her hands. The tart, when she set it down on the wooden board and the smoke cleared enough to see it properly, was not ruined. One edge had darkened slightly more than she would have liked, a shade too deep, a small imperfection along the crust, but the apples across the top had caramelized into a rich amber color, the pastry beneath had risen soft and golden, and the smell filling the small room now was warm and thick and impossibly inviting. cinnamon and butter and something else beneath it that Alara could never quite name but that her grandmother had always called simply love, though Alara had thought as a child that this was only something grandmothers said about food to make children eat their vegetables. Draven had gone very still, watching the tart with an expression Felix had genuinely never seen on his king's face before, not in 9 years of feasts and ceremonies and careful royal composure. It was not hunger exactly, though there was hunger in it. It was something closer to longing, the particular ache of recognizing something you had not realized you missed until the moment it reappeared in front of you. "May I?" Draven said again, quieter this time, and Alara realized he was asking not for permission to look, but for permission to taste. She glanced toward Felix, toward Callum, toward the door still smoking faintly behind her, and found no guidance in any of it. There was only the king's face, waiting, and her grandmother's tart cooling slowly on the board between them, imperfect and simple and utterly unlike anything that had ever been served at a royal table in the history of Veyrath. "Of course, Your Majesty," Alara said, and reached for a knife to cut the first slice. The knife trembled slightly in Alara's hand as she cut through the warm pastry, the crust giving way with a soft crackling sound, apples falling open in neat golden layers beneath it. She set the slice onto a small plate she found on a nearby shelf, plain white with a chip along one edge, nothing like the gilded porcelain that would be carrying the Swan upstairs at this very moment, and held it out toward the King of Veyrath with hands that had not fully stopped shaking since the moment he appeared in the doorway. Draven took the plate from her without hesitation, without the careful ceremony that usually surrounded anything placed before him. No taster to sample it first for poison, no elaborate presentation, no polite murmurs from nobles watching to see how he would react. He simply lifted the small fork resting beside the slice, cut a modest piece, and ate it. For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Felix watched with an expression caught somewhere between concern and fascination, still half expecting some disaster, though what disaster could possibly come from a plain apple tart he could not have said. Callum stood with his arms crossed near the doorway, patient and watchful as always, though even his stoic features had softened slightly with curiosity. Nora, who had crept quietly back down the corridor the moment she realized what was happening, and now hovered just outside the doorframe where she could see but hopefully not be seen, pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from making any sound at all. Draven closed his eyes. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary gesture, and yet Alara felt something shift in the room the moment it happened, as though the king had simply stepped somewhere else entirely, somewhere none of them could follow. When he opened his eyes again several seconds later, something in his expression had changed, softened in a way none of them had words for. "My mother used to make something like this," Draven said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "Not exactly this. Hers had a little more cinnamon, I think, and she always burned the edges slightly, on purpose," she claimed, though I never believed her. "We had a summer house, before I became king, before my father passed and everything changed. There was a small kitchen there, nothing like the palace kitchens, barely large enough for 2 people to stand in at once, and she would bake in the afternoons while I sat at the table doing lessons I did not want to do." He looked down at the half-eaten slice on his plate. "I have not thought of that kitchen in years. I did not realize I still remembered the smell of it until just now." Alara did not know what to say to that. She had expected criticism, or polite dismissal, or perhaps the mild curiosity of a powerful man, briefly amused by something unusual, before returning to more important matters. She had not expected this quiet, unguarded honesty from a king she had never exchanged a single word with before tonight. "I'm sorry for your loss, Your Majesty," she said finally, because it seemed like the only true thing left to say. Draven looked up at her, and for a moment, the weight of 9 years of ruling, of feasts he did not enjoy, and traditions he had stopped questioning long ago, seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders. "Thank you. It has been a long time. Long enough that I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to taste something, and think of her rather than simply think of the next course, the next toast, the next obligation waiting after the meal ends." He gestured toward the tart with his fork. "This is the first thing I have eaten in years that made me stop thinking about any of that." Felix, ever mindful of practical concerns even in a moment clearly meaningful to his king, cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty, the Swan will be presented within the quarter hour. If we do not return to the hall soon, the nobles will begin to worry, or worse, begin to speculate." Draven did not immediately answer. He looked instead at Alara, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and yet somehow could not, as though he were trying to solve some puzzle she did not know she represented. "How did you learn to make this?" "My grandmother taught me," Alara said. "She worked in the palace laundry for over 30 years. She raised me after I was left at the gates. She passed 3 winters ago. Alara hesitated, then added, because the king's steady attention seemed to invite honesty rather than caution. She used to say that food made carelessly tastes careless, no matter how expensive the ingredients are, and food made with attention tastes like attention, even if it's only apples and flour and a little sugar. I don't know if that's true in any way that could be proven, but I believed her. I believe her too, Draven said, based on the evidence in front of me. He set down the empty plate and looked toward Felix, some decision visibly forming behind his eyes. Bring the rest of this tart upstairs. Felix blinked. Your Majesty? Bring it to the hall, all of it. I want it presented alongside the Swan. Alara felt her stomach drop in a way entirely different from the panic she had felt when the tart began to burn. Your Majesty, I don't think that's wise. Chef Voss did not approve this dish. It was not meant for the feast at all. If it's presented alongside the Swan, alongside House Dracot's 11 days of work, there will be... She struggled to find a word large enough for what she feared. Trouble. There will be trouble, Your Majesty, and I don't think it should fall on you, or on the tart, but I fear it very much will fall on me. You let me worry about the trouble, Draven said, and something in his tone left no room for argument, though it was not unkind, simply certain, the voice of a man used to decisions being followed rather than debated. I have sat through 11 years of gold-dusted birds, designed to impress me rather than feed me. Tonight, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, something in this palace surprised me, and I intend to acknowledge it properly. Callum, who had remained mostly silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice low and practical. Your Majesty, if I may, bringing an unapproved dish into the feast, prepared by kitchen staff without authorization, using ingredients not sanctioned for the occasion, may create difficulties beyond simple embarrassment for House Dracot. There are protocols regarding what reaches the royal table, protocols meant to ensure your safety as much as tradition. I ate it already, Callum. If there were any danger in it, we would already know. Draven's tone remained even, though something steadier and more resolute had settled into it. The protocols exist to protect me from poison, not from apples grown in my own cellar and baked by a girl who has served this palace her entire life. I am not afraid of this tart. I am considerably more interested in what it represents. Alara stood frozen, torn between the wild hope rising unbidden in her chest, and the cold certainty that whatever happened next in the Great Hall, she would be the one left to answer for it once the king returned to his other duties, and the nobles remembered exactly who had dared to challenge their carefully constructed feast. Please, Your Majesty, she tried once more. Quieter now. I don't wish for trouble. I only wanted to bake something in memory of my grandmother. I never meant for anyone to see it, let alone. I understand that, Draven said, and something in his expression gentled slightly, some acknowledgement of her fear that had not been there a moment before. But I have spent 9 years pretending to be moved by things that do not move me at all, simply because tradition demanded it. I find I am tired of pretending. This tart moved me. I intend to say so, publicly, regardless of what House Dracot or Chef Voss or anyone else in that hall thinks of the decision. He looked at her steadily. You did not ask for this attention, I understand that, but I will not hide something true simply because it is inconvenient for others. Felix, recognizing the futility of further argument, sighed and gestured for one of the kitchen staff to fetch a proper serving tray. I will have it presented as tastefully as circumstances allow, Your Majesty. Though I suspect tasteful is not the word House Dracot will use once they see it. Alara watched as the remaining tart was carefully lifted onto a borrowed tray, watched Draven straighten his coat and prepare to return to the hall above, and felt, for the first time since she had crept down to the cellar hours ago, a cold certainty settle over the wild hope in her chest. Whatever happened next, she would not be able to hide from it. The king himself had made certain of that. Your Majesty, she said, one final time, as he turned toward the door, whatever happens tonight, I only wanted you to know that the tart was not meant as any kind of statement. It was only apples and memory, nothing more. Draven paused in the doorway and looked back at her, something warm and unreadable in his amber eyes. Sometimes, he said, the simplest things carry the most weight, precisely because they are not trying to prove anything at all. I intend to let the entire hall understand that tonight, whether they wish to hear it or not. And with that, he turned and walked back toward the stairs, Felix and Callum falling into step behind him, leaving Alara standing alone in the smoke-filled kitchen with an empty plate, a half-eaten tart on its way upstairs, and a feeling in her chest she could not name, somewhere between terror and something that felt dangerously close to hope. The great hall had reached the peak of its anticipation by the time Draven returned to his throne. 4 servants from House Dracot already lined up near the kitchen entrance, ready to carry in the gold-dusted swan the moment the king gave his signal. Whispers had spread through the tables during his absence, exactly as Felix predicted. Nobles leaning toward one another with raised eyebrows and knowing glances, speculating about what could possibly have pulled their king away from his own feast for nearly 20 minutes. Lady Rosalind Ashgrove, seated near the high table with the practiced composure of a woman who had spent decades navigating court politics, watched Draven settle back onto his throne with sharp, assessing eyes. Beside her, Lord Percival Dracot, whose family had commissioned the Swan and whose reputation now rested entirely on its reception, shifted anxiously in his seat, glancing toward the kitchen entrance where his prized dish waited to be presented. "Where did you go, Your Majesty, if I may ask?" Lady Rosalind's voice carried just enough volume to be heard by the surrounding tables, a question dressed as polite curiosity but carrying an edge of challenge beneath it. "We worried something might be wrong." "Nothing was wrong," Draven said, settling back with an ease that had been absent from his posture all evening. "I simply discovered something worth investigating." Before Lady Rosalind could press further, the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and House Dracot's chef entered at the head of a small procession, carrying the gold-dusted swan aloft on its silver tray, exactly as rehearsed, exactly as planned across 11 careful days of preparation. A ripple of appreciative murmurs moved through the hall as the dish was carried toward the high table, torchlight catching the thin gold leaf and making the entire bird seem to shimmer as it moved. Lord Percival rose slightly from his seat, pride visible in every line of his posture, watching as the swan was set down before the king, with all the ceremony such an occasion demanded. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man certain of his triumph, "House Dracot presents the Ascension Swan, crafted in your honor, gilded in the finest gold Veyrath's mines have to offer." Draven regarded the swan for a long moment, and the hall fell silent, waiting for the traditional words of praise that always followed such presentations, the same words spoken every year in some slight variation, honoring the effort, the artistry, the loyalty of the house that had prepared it. Instead, Draven raised one hand, and a servant Felix had quietly instructed near the kitchen entrance stepped forward, carrying a second tray, considerably smaller and considerably plainer than the golden swan resting before the king. On it sat the apple tart, its crust slightly darkened along one edge, its apples arranged in simple overlapping rings, utterly unremarkable beside the shimmering bird it was placed next to. A confused murmur swept through the hall. Lord Percival's confident expression faltered, his eyes darting between the swan and the strange plain dish now sitting beside it, uncertain what significance it could possibly hold. "Before I address House Dracot's magnificent effort," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "I want every person in this room to understand something about tonight." He gestured toward the tart. "This dish was not prepared by any royal chef. It was not commissioned by any noble house. It contains no gold, no saffron, no rare ingredient shipped from distant shores. It is, in the simplest terms, an apple tart, made with apples from our own cellar, baked by a young woman who works in the lowest tier of this palace's kitchens." The murmur grew louder, confusion mixing now with something closer to alarm among the assembled nobles. Chef Edwin Voss, standing near the kitchen entrance where he had come to observe the swan's presentation, went very still, his face draining of color as understanding began to dawn. "I have sat through 11 Ascension feasts," Draven continued, "and in every one of them, I have eaten what tradition placed before me, praised what tradition told me to praise, and felt, if I am honest, very little at all beyond polite obligation. Tonight, for the first time in 11 years, something served in this palace made me feel something real. It was not the swan." He paused, letting the words settle over the hall. "It was this tart." Lord Percival's face had gone through several colors in rapid succession, settling finally on a deep, humiliated red. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot mean to suggest that a servant's tart, made without permission, using stolen ingredients, holds equal merit to 11 days of masterwork, prepared by House Dracot's finest chef." "I am not suggesting equal merit," Draven said, his tone even but firm. "I am stating that it moved me more. The swan is beautiful. It is, without question, a work of considerable skill and effort, and I do not wish to diminish that." He looked around the hall slowly, meeting the eyes of noble after noble seated at the long tables. But beauty and effort are not the only measures of worth. Sometimes the simplest thing, made with genuine care rather than genuine ambition, carries more weight than anything gilded ever could. A tense silence fell over the hall, broken only by the soft crackle of candle flames and the shifting of uncomfortable bodies in expensive chairs. Lady Rosalind's expression had shifted from curious to calculating, her sharp eyes moving between the king, the tart, and the humiliated Lord Percival with the careful attention of someone already reworking the political implications of what she had just witnessed. Edwin Voss stepped forward from near the kitchen entrance, his composure cracking visibly beneath the weight of public embarrassment. "Your Majesty, if I may, this dish was made without my knowledge or approval, using ingredients meant for the royal kitchen's sanctioned menu. Whatever girl prepared this acted entirely outside her authority, and I take full responsibility for failing to prevent such an unauthorized use of palace resources." "You take responsibility for failing to prevent it," Draven repeated, something cool entering his tone for the first time all evening. "And yet it was your words, Chef Voss, that apparently inspired her to bake it in the first place. I understand you described such simple food as unfit for a king's table." Edwin's face went pale. Somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a servant who had overheard the earlier exchange between Edwin and his assistant must have repeated it to someone, and word had clearly traveled faster and further than Edwin had anticipated. He opened his mouth, searching for some response that might salvage the situation, and found nothing adequate to offer. "I do not fault you for having an opinion about food, Chef Voss," Draven continued, his voice returning to something more measured, "but I would encourage you to remember, going forward, that the measure of a dish's worth is not determined solely by its cost or its complexity. Tonight, that lesson was demonstrated rather more publicly than perhaps either of us anticipated." The hall remained tense, nobles exchanging glances that ranged from amused to scandalized, the political weight of what had just occurred settling slowly over the assembled court. House Dracott's carefully cultivated triumph had been publicly overshadowed, not by another noble house's competing dish, but by an unnamed kitchen servant's simple tart, and every person in that room understood that such a public reversal would not be forgotten easily by anyone involved. Draven, apparently satisfied that his point had been made, lifted a small knife and cut himself a second slice of the tart, eating it with visible enjoyment in front of the entire hall, a gesture that carried more weight than any formal declaration could have. "The tart," he said simply, "is the finest thing I have eaten in this hall in 9 years. I intend to say so plainly, and I do not require anyone else's agreement to know it is true." Near the back of the hall, having been quietly summoned upstairs at Felix's discreet instruction moments earlier, Alara stood half-hidden behind a stone pillar, having witnessed the entire exchange with growing horror. She had wanted, more than anything in that moment, to disappear entirely, to become invisible, to undo the decision that had led her down to the cellar hours earlier and set this entire evening into motion. She could feel eyes beginning to search the hall, whispers already speculating about the servant girl the king had mentioned, and she understood, with a cold certainty settling deep in her stomach, that whatever quiet obscurity she had lived in for 17 years had just ended, permanently, in front of the entire royal court. She did not yet know how many of those watching eyes had already begun, in that very moment, planning how to make her regret ever lighting that crooked, forgotten oven. The knock on the door came just past midnight, sharp and sudden, and Alara sat upright in her narrow bed before she had even fully woken, her heart already racing. Nora, in the bed across the small room, stirred and sat up too, both of them staring toward the door with matching expressions of alarm. "Who is it?" Alara called out, her voice unsteady in the darkness. No answer came, only another knock, harder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of the door latch being tested from the outside. Alara scrambled out of bed, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and crossed the cold floor to press her ear against the wood. "Alara," came a voice she recognized, one of the older kitchen maids, breathless and hushed. "Open up, quickly. It's about you." She unlatched the door to find the maid, a woman named Agatha who had worked in the palace laundry alongside Alara's grandmother for years, standing in the corridor with a lit candle, and an expression of deep worry etched across her weathered face. "What's happened?" Alara asked, fear already coiling tight in her chest. "There's talk spreading through the servants' quarters," Agatha said, glancing anxiously back down the hallway as though expecting someone to appear behind her at any moment. "Some of the noble houses are saying you used forbidden magic to enchant the king's senses, that no ordinary tart could have pulled the Alpha King away from his own feast without some kind of spell involved." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. In Veyrath, accusations of forbidden magic were not taken lightly. Wolf society held deep old fears about enchantment interfering with an alpha's judgment, fears rooted in centuries of history where such accusations, whether true or false, had ended careers, reputations, and sometimes lives. That's absurd, Nora said from behind Alara, having risen and joined them at the door, her voice sharp with indignation. It was a tart, nothing more. Alara doesn't know the first thing about magic. I know that, child, and you know that, Agatha said gently. But rumors don't care much for truth once they start spreading through a court full of nobles, looking for someone to blame for their embarrassment. Chef Voss has been seen talking with members of House Dracot and House Ashgrove late into the evening. I don't like the shape of it. Alara's mind raced back to the hall, to Lord Percival's humiliated face, to Lady Rosalind's calculating eyes watching the entire exchange with far too much interest for comfort. She thought of Edwin Voss, publicly rebuked by the king himself, his authority as head chef undermined in front of the entire court by a servant girl he had never considered worth noticing before tonight. What should I do? Alara asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded. Stay quiet. Stay careful. Don't give them anything more to talk about, Agatha said, though even she did not sound entirely convinced this would be enough. I only came to warn you because your grandmother was dear to me, and I would not forgive myself if something happened to her granddaughter that I could have prevented by simply knocking on a door. After Agatha left, promising to return if she heard anything further, Alara sat back down on the edge of her bed, unable to sleep, her mind circling endlessly around the accusation Agatha had described. Forbidden magic. The words alone were dangerous enough to ruin her, regardless of whether a single soul in the palace actually believed them. They can't possibly believe it, Nora said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words intended. They don't need to believe it, Alara said quietly, staring at the small candle Agatha had left behind, its flame flickering in the draught seeping through the old window frame. They only need enough people to say it loudly enough. Elsewhere in the palace, in a private study lit by a single lamp and heavy with the smell of old parchment and spiced wine, Edwin Voss sat across from Lord Percival Dracot and Lady Rosalind Ashgrove, the three of them gathered in the late hours of the night with the particular quiet urgency of people plotting something they did not wish overheard. The king humiliated me in front of the entire court, Lord Percival said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. 11 days of preparation, dismissed in favor of some servant's charity case. Tart, do you understand what this means for House Dracot's standing? We will be the laughingstock of every noble family in Veyrath by week's end. The damage is done, Lady Rosalind said, swirling her wine slowly, her expression far calmer than Lord Percival's, though no less calculating. The question now is how we repair it, and I believe our answer lies with the girl herself. Edwin leaned forward, his earlier humiliation in the hall having curdled overnight into something sharper and more dangerous. The accusation of magic has already begun spreading. I did not start it myself, though I confess I have not discouraged it either. If enough of the court believes the king's judgment was influenced by some enchantment, rather than his own genuine taste, then his decision tonight can be dismissed entirely, the Swan's honor can be restored, and the girl, he paused, something cold entering his expression, the girl can be removed from the palace before she causes any further disruption. Removed how exactly? Lady Rosalind asked, her tone deceptively mild. There are procedures for dealing with suspected enchantment, Edwin said. A formal accusation, an investigation by the court magistrates, a trial if necessary. Such things take time, certainly, but they also carry weight. Even the king cannot simply dismiss a formal accusation of forbidden magic without appearing to protect the accused for reasons that would raise further suspicion. Lord Percival's expression sharpened with interest at that, some of his earlier fury cooling into calculated satisfaction. And if the investigation finds evidence, real or otherwise, that supports the accusation, then the girl is dealt with according to the old laws, Edwin said simply. And House Dracot's honor is restored, along with my own position as head chef, which the king's little display this evening has left rather precarious. Lady Rosalind considered this for a long moment, tapping one manicured finger against the rim of her wineglass. It is a dangerous game to play against the king's expressed favor, even indirectly. If he suspects our involvement, he will suspect nothing, Edwin said, if we are careful. The accusation need not come from any of us directly. Rumors have a way of gathering their own momentum once planted in the right soil. We need only ensure the soil remains fertile. Outside the study door, unnoticed by any of the three conspirators within, a young servant boy who had been sent to deliver a late message paused in the shadowed corridor, having caught enough of the conversation through the thick wood to understand that something dangerous was being planned against the kitchen girl the entire palace was now whispering about. He hesitated only a moment before hurrying away, uncertain who to tell, but certain that someone needed to know. By the time morning light began filtering through the narrow window of Alara's small room, She had not slept at all, her mind circling endlessly between fear and a stubborn refusal to regret what she had done. She rose before the palace bells rang for the morning shift, dressed quietly so as not to wake Nora, and made her way toward the kitchens with the same routine she had followed every morning for years, though nothing about this morning felt routine at all. She did not yet know that a boy's warning was already making its way toward Captain Callum Ward, nor that the king himself had already begun to suspect, based on nothing more than instinct and years of reading his own court's moods, that last night's triumph had planted seeds of danger he had not yet fully accounted for. Elara had barely begun scrubbing the first pot of the morning when 2 guards appeared at the kitchen entrance, their expressions grim and formal, their eyes scanning the room until they found her. The kitchen fell silent around her, other servants pausing mid-task, spoons and knives held frozen in the air as every eye turned toward the unfolding scene. "Elara, no family name," one of the guards said, his voice carrying the flat, official tone of a man reciting practiced words. "You are summoned to appear before the court magistrate to answer an accusation of forbidden enchantment against the crown." Elara's hands went cold, the wet rag slipping from her fingers and landing with a soft splash back into the basin. Around her, the other kitchen servants had gone utterly still, some watching with wide, frightened eyes, others suddenly finding urgent reasons to look away entirely, unwilling to be associated with whatever was happening. "There must be some mistake," Elara managed, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. "I have done nothing but bake a tart. I used no magic. I don't even know how such magic would be performed." "That is a matter for the magistrate to determine," the second guard said, stepping forward with clear intent to escort her from the kitchen. "You will come with us now." Nora, who had been carrying a tray of morning bread nearby, dropped it entirely, the loaves scattering across the stone floor as she rushed forward. "You can't just take her. She's done nothing wrong. This is madness." "Stand back," the first guard warned, though not unkindly, clearly uncomfortable with the task assigned to him. "This is not our decision to make. The accusation came through proper channels, and we are bound to follow procedure." Elara felt the walls of the kitchen seem to close in around her, the faces of servants she had known her entire life watching with expressions ranging from pity to fear, none of them daring to speak up on her behalf against a formal accusation carrying the weight of the old laws. She thought, with a distant, panicked clarity, that this was precisely what Agatha had warned her about the night before, the rumor gaining exactly the momentum it needed to become something far more dangerous than mere gossip. Just as the guards moved to take hold of her arms, a sharp voice cut across the kitchen from the doorway. "Stand down, both of you." Captain Callum Ward strode into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention, his expression carrying an authority that made both guards freeze mid-motion. Behind him trailed the young servant boy who had overheard the conspiracy the night before, looking simultaneously relieved and terrified at having set these events into motion. "Captain Ward," the first guard said, straightening immediately, "we have orders from the court magistrate to bring the girl in for questioning regarding an accusation of—" "I am aware of the accusation," Callum said, cutting him off. "I am also aware, as of this morning, that the accusation was manufactured deliberately by parties seeking to discredit the king's judgment from last night's feast. I have already informed His Majesty of these developments, and he has ordered that no action be taken against this young woman until he has personally addressed the matter." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly caught between conflicting orders and unwilling to risk defying either the magistrate's summons or the king's captain of the guard. "Captain, the magistrate's order came through official channels. We cannot simply—" "You can, and you will, because I am telling you the king himself is aware of this situation and intends to address it directly," Callum said, his voice leaving no room for further argument. "If the magistrate has concerns about that decision, he may bring them to His Majesty personally. Until then, this young woman remains under the crown's protection, not under arrest." Elara stood frozen through the entire exchange, her heart still pounding, uncertain whether to feel relief or simply a different, more complicated fear at learning the king himself had already become involved in whatever conspiracy was unfolding around her. Nora gripped her arm tightly. Whether to comfort her or steady herself, Elara could not tell. "Come with me," Callum said to her, his tone gentling considerably now that the immediate crisis had passed. "His Majesty wishes to see you, now, before this situation grows any further out of hand." As they walked together through the palace corridors, moving away from the kitchens and toward the grander halls where Elara had rarely set foot in 17 years of living within these walls, Callum spoke quietly, clearly aware of how frightened she still was. "A servant boy overheard 3 individuals discussing a plan to have you formally accused of forbidden magic," he explained. "He brought the information to me late last night, and I informed the king immediately. His Majesty was, to put it plainly, not pleased. Who were they? Ilara asked, though some cold part of her already suspected the answer. I am not at liberty to say with certainty until the matter is properly investigated, Callum said carefully. But I suspect you can imagine at least one name involved, given the events of last night's feast. Ilara's stomach tightened further, thinking of Edwin Voss's pale, furious face in the hall, of Lord Percival's humiliated expression, of Lady Rosalind's cold, calculating eyes watching the entire scene unfold with far too much interest. She had known, even in the moment of the king's public praise, that such a triumph would not go unanswered. She simply had not expected the answer to arrive so quickly, or so dangerously. They reached the throne room sooner than Ilara expected, its towering doors already open, revealing Draven seated not on his throne but on a lower, simpler chair positioned closer to the entrance, Felix standing beside him with a grave expression, and no one else present in the vast hall beyond the three of them and Callum, who took up a position near the door. Your Majesty, Ilara said, dropping into a curtsy the moment she crossed the threshold, her legs unsteady beneath her. Rise, Draven said, and something in his voice carried a quiet, contained anger that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with what had nearly happened to her that morning. I am told you were very nearly taken from the kitchens this morning, to answer an accusation that you enchanted my senses using forbidden magic. I did not use magic, Your Majesty, Ilara said quickly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. I swear it. I only baked a tart, the way my grandmother taught me. There was nothing more to it than apples and flour and— I know, Draven said, cutting gently through her rising panic. I have not doubted that for a single moment. I ate the tart myself, Ilara. I know precisely what moved me last night, and it was not enchantment. It was honesty, something this court has grown dangerously unfamiliar with. Relief flooded through her, so sudden and overwhelming that her knees very nearly gave out beneath her. Felix stepped forward slightly, his expression softening at the sight of her visible distress. His Majesty has ordered a full inquiry into how this accusation originated, and by whom. Until that inquiry concludes, you are to remain under direct royal protection, housed within the main palace rather than the servants' quarters, and no further action may be taken against you without his personal authorization. I don't understand, Ilara said, genuinely bewildered by the sudden shift in her circumstances. Yesterday I was scrubbing pots. Today I am being protected by the crown itself. I don't know how to make sense of any of this, Your Majesty. Draven rose from his chair and crossed the small distance between them, his expression serious but not unkind. Neither do I, fully, if I am honest. But I know this much. Something true happened in that kitchen last night, and I will not allow it to be twisted into something false simply because it embarrassed powerful people who prefer their world to remain exactly as comfortable and unchallenged as it has always been. He paused, studying her face carefully. You did nothing wrong, Ilara. I intend to make certain the entire court understands that, whether they wish to hear it or not. Ilara looked up at him, this king who had walked away from his own feast for the smell of an apple tart, who had defended her honor in front of a room full of nobles without hesitation, and felt something shift inside her chest that she did not yet have words for, something that went beyond gratitude, beyond relief, into territory she was not entirely certain she was prepared to explore. Thank you, Your Majesty, she said quietly, and meant it more deeply than she had ever meant anything in her life. Behind them, unseen by any in the throne room, word of the morning's events was already beginning to travel through the palace's hidden corridors, reaching ears that would not take kindly to the king's continued protection of a lowly kitchen servant, and setting into motion consequences none of them, not even Draven himself, could yet fully foresee. The court magistrate, a stern elderly man named Warwick Thorne who had served 3 kings before Draven and prided himself on strict adherence to procedure, arrived at the throne room within the hour, summoned by the king himself to answer for how a fabricated accusation had so nearly resulted in a servant girl's arrest without proper verification. Your Majesty, Warwick began, bowing stiffly before the throne, where Draven now sat with considerably more authority in his bearing than he had shown during the private conversation with Ilara earlier. I understand there are concerns about the accusation brought against the kitchen servant this morning. I assure you, the formal complaint followed every established procedure for such matters. The procedure may have been followed correctly, Draven said, his voice cool and measured. But the accusation itself was fabricated by individuals seeking to undermine my judgment for their own political purposes. I want to know who filed the formal complaint, Magistrate Thorne, and I want to know today. Warwick hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with revealing information that implicated powerful noble houses, but the king's expression left little room for evasion. The complaint was filed by Chef Edwin Voss, Your Majesty, citing concerns raised independently by several unnamed nobles regarding the unusual circumstances of last night's feast. Unnamed nobles, Draven repeated flatly. How convenient that they remain unnamed while their accusation nearly cost an innocent young woman her freedom, or worse. Felix, standing nearby with a scroll of notes he had been compiling since early morning, stepped forward. Your Majesty, my own inquiries this morning have uncovered testimony from a servant boy who overheard a private conversation last night between Chef Voss, Lord Percival Draycott, and Lady Rosalind Ashgrove, in which they explicitly discussed manufacturing an accusation of forbidden magic against Alara, in order to discredit your judgment and restore House Draycott's damaged reputation. A heavy silence fell over the throne room. Warwick's face had gone pale, understanding immediately the severity of what Felix had just revealed. Fabricating an accusation of forbidden magic was itself a serious crime under Veyrath's old laws, one that carried consequences far more severe than the punishment they had hoped to inflict on Alara. Summon them, Draven said simply. All three. I want this addressed publicly, before the full court, so there can be no question afterward about what occurred or why. Within the hour, the throne room had filled with members of the court, summoned on short notice and buzzing with confused speculation about the sudden gathering. Edwin Voss, Lord Percival, and Lady Rosalind stood before the throne, each maintaining careful composure despite the obvious tension radiating from all three of them. Chef Voss, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. You filed a formal accusation against a kitchen servant this morning, claiming she used forbidden magic to influence my judgment at last night's feast. I would like you to explain, before this entire court, precisely what evidence supports such a serious claim. Edwin's composure faltered visibly under the weight of the king's attention and the assembled court's curious eyes. Your Majesty, the circumstances were unusual. No ordinary Tart should have drawn you away from a royal feast so suddenly. It seemed the only reasonable explanation. The only reasonable explanation, Draven interrupted, or the most convenient one, given that the alternative explanation was simply that your own dish, however skillfully crafted, failed to move me as deeply as a simple tart made with genuine care. Edwin said nothing, his silence answer enough for the assembled court, several of whom exchanged knowing glances at the implication now hanging plainly in the air. I have testimony, Draven continued, confirming that you, along with Lord Percival Draycott and Lady Rosalind Ashgrove, met privately last night to discuss fabricating this very accusation, specifically to discredit my judgment and remove an innocent young woman from the palace through fraudulent means. Lord Percival's face drained of color entirely, while Lady Rosalind's composure cracked only slightly, though she recovered quickly, her sharp mind clearly already calculating how best to salvage the situation. Your Majesty, surely there has been some misunderstanding. We discussed the unusual events of the evening, certainly, but I would not characterize our conversation as, a servant boy overheard your conversation clearly enough to report its contents to Captain Ward within the hour, Draven said, cutting through her attempted deflection. I do not require further clarification of what was discussed or intended. The throne room had grown utterly silent, the weight of the king's words settling over the assembled nobles like a physical presence. Fabricating an accusation of forbidden magic against an innocent person was among the gravest crimes recognized under Veyrath's old laws, precisely because such accusations, if left unchecked, could be used to destroy anyone the powerful wished to remove from their path. Under different circumstances, Draven said, his voice hardening further, such a crime would warrant severe punishment under the old laws. However, I am mindful that House Draycott and House Ashgrove both hold long histories of loyal service to this crown, histories I do not wish to see erased entirely by the poor judgment of a few individuals in a single moment of wounded pride. Lord Percival's shoulders sagged slightly with visible relief at the king's words, though the tension in the room remained thick. Therefore, Draven continued, I will not pursue the full weight of the old laws against you, but understand this clearly, all three of you, and let everyone present understand it as well. Alara remains under my direct protection from this moment forward. Any further attempt to threaten her safety, her reputation, or her position within this palace will be treated not as a matter of court politics, but as a direct challenge to the crown itself, and will be answered accordingly. Edwin Voss, recognizing the full weight of what had just occurred, understanding that his position as head chef now hung by the thinnest of threads, bowed stiffly and said nothing further, though the fury simmering behind his carefully controlled expression suggested this was far from the end of his resentment. Lord Percival, still pale, offered a stammered apology that satisfied no one but was accepted regardless. Lady Rosalind alone maintained her composure fully, offering a measured diplomatic acknowledgement of the king's decision, though her eyes, when they briefly met Alara's from across the room, carried a coldness that promised this matter was not so easily concluded in her own mind. As the court began to disperse, murmuring quietly amongst themselves about the extraordinary events of the morning, Alara remained near the edge of the throne room, having been summoned to witness the proceedings at Draven's insistence, though she had said nothing throughout the entire exchange. She caught Edwin Voss's eye briefly as he turned to leave, and something in his expression, some barely contained hatred simmering just beneath the surface, sent a cold chill through her that the king's protection had not entirely managed to dispel. Later that evening, once the throne room had emptied and the palace had settled back into its usual quiet rhythms, Draven found Alara standing alone near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, watching the last light of evening fade behind the distant mountains. "You are troubled," he observed, coming to stand beside her. "Chef Voss did not look like a man who considers this matter settled," Alara admitted quietly. "Neither did Lady Rosalind, if I am honest, Your Majesty." Draven was silent for a moment, considering her words carefully. "You may be right. I have offered them mercy today, but mercy does not always earn gratitude in return. Some people only grow more resentful when shown leniency they believe they did not deserve." He turned to look at her directly, "Which is why I intend to ensure you remain protected, regardless of whether this matter is truly finished or merely delayed." Alara looked up at him. This king who had upended his entire court's carefully maintained order for the sake of a simple tart and the girl who baked it, and felt, once again, that strange unfamiliar warmth stirring in her chest, tangled uncomfortably with the cold certainty that danger had not fully passed, merely retreated into shadows where it could gather strength before striking again. 3 weeks passed, and the palace slowly settled into an uneasy new rhythm. Alara had been moved from the servants' quarters into a small but comfortable chamber closer to the main halls, a change that had earned her curious and occasionally resentful glances from staff who did not understand why an orphan girl with no family name now enjoyed accommodations far above her former station. She had also been given a new role, working directly in the palace's main kitchen rather than the lowest tier where she had spent her entire life, a promotion that Edwin Voss had been forced to accept publicly, though his private resentment toward her had only deepened with each passing day. Draven visited the kitchens more frequently now than he ever had before, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the palace staff, who whispered among themselves about the unusual sight of their king wandering into spaces traditionally reserved for servants, his excuses growing progressively thinner each time. He claimed to be checking on the quality of the ingredients being sourced for upcoming feasts, or reviewing the kitchen's efficiency, or simply taking air away from the pressures of the throne room. But everyone, including Alara herself, understood the true reason behind his visits had very little to do with ingredients or efficiency. "You've come to check on the flour supply again," Alara said one afternoon, not quite hiding her smile as Draven wandered into the kitchen for the 3rd time that week, his expression carefully neutral in a way that fooled absolutely no one. "The flour supply is a matter of considerable importance to the kingdom's well-being," Draven said, with the particular solemnity of a man who knew perfectly well how thin his excuse sounded, and had decided to commit to it anyway. "Is it?" Alara said, arching an eyebrow as she continued kneading dough for the evening's bread. "I confess I did not realize the Crown took such a personal interest in flour." "The Crown takes a personal interest in many things," Draven said, leaning against the counter beside her with an ease that would have seemed impossible only a month earlier, when he had been a distant, formal figure she glimpsed only from across crowded halls. "Flour today, perhaps something else tomorrow." Alara laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise them both slightly, given how little laughter had passed between a king and a kitchen servant in all the history of Veyrath that either of them knew of. "You are terrible at pretending, Your Majesty." "I have never claimed to be a skilled actor," Draven admitted, watching her work with quiet, comfortable attention. "I have spent 9 years pretending to enjoy feasts that bored me, and conversations that exhausted me. I find I have very little patience left for pretending about things that genuinely interest me." Something in the way he said it, quiet and direct, made Alara's hands still briefly over the dough before she resumed kneading, her cheeks warming slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "And what genuinely interests you, Your Majesty, if not flour?" "Honesty," Draven said simply. "I have found very little of it in this palace across 9 years of ruling. Everyone around me measures their words carefully, calculating how each sentence might affect their standing, their reputation, their influence. You have never once measured your words that way with me." Even now, teasing your own king about flour, you speak exactly as you think, without calculation. Elara considered this, wiping flour from her hands on her apron as she turned to face him fully. Perhaps that is only because I have nothing to gain by calculating my words carefully. I have no family name to protect, no political ambitions, no noble house depending on my favor with the crown. It is easier to be honest when you have very little to lose. Perhaps, Draven allowed, though something in his expression suggested he believed there was more to it than that. Or perhaps honesty is simply a rarer quality than most people realize, and you happen to possess it in abundance regardless of what you have or have not to lose. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, Elara returning to her work while Draven remained nearby, watching the practiced movements of her hands, the quiet efficiency with which she managed the demands of the kitchen despite having spent barely 3 weeks in this elevated role. It was, Draven had come to realize over these visits, one of the things he found most compelling about her. This quiet competence, combined with an utter lack of pretension, a stark contrast to the carefully performed confidence he encountered constantly among the nobles of his court. Nora, who had also been moved into the main kitchen alongside her friend, watched these exchanges with poorly concealed amusement, exchanging knowing glances with other kitchen staff whenever the king lingered a little too long, or laughed a little too easily at something Elara said. She had not spoken directly to Elara about what she suspected was developing between her friend and the Alpha King of Veyrath, sensing that such an observation might frighten Elara away from something that seemed, despite all its complications, to be bringing her genuine happiness for the first time since her grandmother's passing. Not everyone in the palace watched these developments with such warmth, however. Edwin Voss observed the king's frequent kitchen visits with mounting resentment, his authority as head chef increasingly undermined by a servant girl who had somehow captured the king's personal attention through nothing more than an unauthorized tart and stubborn honesty. He had been forced publicly to accept her promotion, to treat her with professional courtesy in front of the king and the rest of the kitchen staff, but privately, his hatred toward her had only deepened, fed by wounded pride and the growing certainty that his own position within the palace grew more precarious with each passing week. He was not the only one nursing such resentment in silence. Lady Rosalind Ashgrove, though she had made no further overt move against Elara since the king's public rebuke, had not forgotten the humiliation of that morning, nor abandoned her belief that a kitchen servant with no family name had no rightful place occupying the king's personal attention, however innocently that attention had come to be earned. She watched from a careful distance, gathering information quietly, waiting for an opportunity that would not risk drawing the crown's direct anger down upon her again. That opportunity arrived one evening when Elara, working late to prepare ingredients for the following day's meals, discovered something deeply unsettling tucked among the flour sacks in the pantry storage room. A small vial, nearly empty, its label deliberately scratched away, containing a faint bitter residue that Elara, with her years of kitchen experience, recognized immediately as something that did not belong among cooking ingredients at all. Her hands trembled as she held the vial up to the lamplight, understanding with sudden, cold clarity that someone had been tampering with the kitchen supplies, and that whoever had done so had access to spaces that should have been carefully monitored and secured. She thought immediately of Edwin Voss, of Lady Rosalind's cold, calculating eyes, of the danger Draven had warned her might still be lurking despite the mercy he had shown weeks earlier. She did not know, standing alone in the dim pantry with the vial clutched tightly in her shaking hand, that this discovery marked only the beginning of a far more dangerous chapter unfolding within the palace walls, one that would test not only her own safety, but the strength of everything that had grown quietly between herself and the King of Veyrath in the weeks since that first fateful evening. Elara's first instinct was to run straight to Captain Callum Ward, and she did exactly that, hurrying through the darkened corridors with the vial wrapped carefully in a cloth, her heart pounding with a fear sharper than anything she had felt even during the earlier accusation of forbidden magic. This felt different. This felt like something meant not to discredit her, but to genuinely harm someone, and the thought turned her stomach with dread. Callum examined the vial carefully under proper light once she reached him, his expression growing graver by the moment. "This is a sedative compound, and a strong one," he said quietly, "enough to cause serious illness if consumed in any significant quantity, particularly if slipped into food or drink without the person's knowledge. Where exactly did you find this?" "Tucked among the flour sacks in the pantry," Elara said, still trying to steady her breathing. "I only found it because I knocked over a sack while reaching for something on a higher shelf. If I hadn't, it might have gone unnoticed until someone actually used the tainted flour in a dish." Callum's jaw tightened. This changes matters considerably. An accusation of magic is dangerous, but this is something else entirely. This is an attempt at genuine harm, and it must be reported to the king immediately. They found Draven in his private study, reviewing reports by lamplight, and his expression shifted from mild surprise at their late arrival to sharp, focused alarm the moment Callum explained what Alara had discovered. He rose immediately, taking the vial from Callum's hands and examining it himself with the same grim intensity. "Who has access to that pantry?" Draven asked, his voice low and controlled in a way that Alara had come to recognize as far more dangerous than open anger. "Kitchen staff primarily," Callum said, "though the head chef holds keys to every storage area in the kitchen wing, as does his senior assistant." "Voss," Draven said, the name coming out clipped and cold. "We cannot be certain without further investigation," Callum cautioned, though his tone suggested he shared the king's suspicion entirely. "But given recent history, he remains the most obvious possibility." Draven turned to Alara, his expression softening slightly despite the tension radiating from every line of his posture. "Are you harmed? Did you touch the substance directly, or breathe it in?" "No, Your Majesty. I found it in the vial, sealed. I did not open it beyond a small crack to identify the smell." Ilara's voice trembled slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I only worry about what might have happened had someone actually used it in a dish meant for the kitchen staff. Or worse." "Or worse," Draven repeated grimly, understanding immediately the implication that such a tampering could easily have found its way into food prepared for far more significant targets than ordinary kitchen staff, given how frequently ingredients moved between different areas of palace food preparation. The investigation that followed moved swiftly under Callum's direction, guards quietly questioning kitchen staff, searching Edwin Voss's private quarters under royal authority, and within 2 days, additional evidence emerged confirming what Draven had already suspected. A merchant who supplied rare compounds to the palace's medical staff testified, under careful questioning, that Edwin Voss had purchased a suspicious quantity of the sedative compound several weeks earlier, claiming it was needed for a specific delicate recipe that, upon investigation, proved entirely fictional. Confronted with this evidence in a private hearing before the king, Edwin Voss finally broke, his carefully maintained composure crumbling entirely under the weight of what he had done. "I only meant to make her ill enough to require dismissal from her duties," he admitted, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and lingering resentment. "Nothing more. I never intended anything permanent. I only wanted her removed from the kitchen. From your attention, Your Majesty, before she destroyed everything I had built here across 2 decades of service. You planted a dangerous substance among ingredients used to prepare food for an entire palace," Draven said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made even Callum, standing nearby, shift uncomfortably. "You had no way of controlling who might have consumed that tainted flour, nor how severely they might have suffered as a result. This was not a harmless attempt to inconvenience one servant. This was reckless endangerment of everyone within these walls." Edwin had no response adequate to that accusation, his silence confirming everything the investigation had already revealed. Draven's judgment, delivered swiftly and without further mercy this time, stripped Edwin Voss of his position as head chef and banished him permanently from the palace grounds, a punishment considerably lighter than what the old laws technically permitted for endangering the crown's household, but severe enough to end, definitively, whatever influence and authority he had once held within Veyrath's court. Lady Rosalind Ashgrove, though never directly implicated in the sedative plot itself, found her own standing at court quietly diminished in the weeks that followed, as whispers of her earlier involvement in the false magic accusation continued circulating despite her careful attempts to distance herself from the entire affair. She withdrew gradually from the political prominence she had once enjoyed, her ambitions toward greater influence at court effectively ended by association with schemes that had ultimately failed, and reflected poorly on everyone involved. With the immediate danger finally resolved, the palace slowly settled into calmer waters, though Alara found herself unable to fully relax even weeks after Edwin Voss's banishment, some lingering wariness remaining from the sustained threat she had lived under since that first fateful night of the Ascension Feast. It was Draven who finally coaxed her fully back into ease, arranging, several weeks later, a quiet evening in the small kitchen where their entire strange story had first begun, away from the formal halls and watching eyes of the court. Just the two of them and a fresh batch of apples gathered from the palace orchard. "I thought perhaps we might bake something together this time," Draven said, standing somewhat awkwardly in an apron Felix had procured for the occasion, looking entirely out of place and yet somehow more at ease than Alara had ever seen him during any formal court function. "You want to bake," Alara said, unable to entirely hide her amusement at the sight of the Alpha King of Veyrath standing in a modest kitchen, wearing an apron dusted faintly with flour already, having clearly attempted some preparation before her arrival. "I want to understand what made that first tart taste the way it did," Draven admitted. "I have thought about it often these past weeks. I believe it had less to do with the apples or the cinnamon, and considerably more to do with the care behind them. I find I would like to understand that feeling more directly, rather than simply tasting its result." Ilara smiled, warmth spreading through her chest in a way that had become familiar over these past weeks, no longer tangled quite so tightly with fear or uncertainty. "Then let me show you properly this time. No crooked oven, no secret smoke, no danger of being discovered." They worked together through the evening, Draven proving considerably less skilled with a rolling pin than with matters of state, earning gentle teasing from Ilara each time his pastry came out uneven, or his apple slices too thick, but neither of them minded the imperfection of it, finding instead a quiet joy in simply working side by side, unburdened for once by titles or expectations, or the watching eyes of an entire court. When the tart finally emerged from the oven, considerably less elegant than the one Ilara had baked alone weeks earlier, but no less filled with genuine warmth, Draven cut 2 slices and handed one to her, sitting together at the small worn table where servants usually took their hurried meals between duties. "To honesty," Draven said, raising his slice slightly in a small, informal toast, "and to the courage it takes to offer something true, even when the whole world seems built to prefer gilded lies instead." Ilara raised her own slice to meet his, smiling with a warmth that reached all the way to her heart. "To simple things," she said, "and to the king who was wise enough to choose them, when he could have had all the gold in Veyrath instead." Outside the small kitchen window, the palace settled into the quiet stillness of a peaceful evening, the danger of recent weeks finally receding into memory, and within those humble walls, an alpha king and an orphan girl shared a simple apple tart together, neither gold nor grand, and found in it something far more lasting than any feast Veyrath's court had ever known.